This is a photo taken just outside of Paris. And right here are the actual signatures of the Treaty of Versailles, which officially ended World War I. But there's a problem with this treaty. Most Germans reject it because they don't believe that their country started World War I. And they have a point. There were lots of things that led up to the war, and it wasn't solely Germany's fault. However, Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles placed all of the blame on Germany. This article is commonly known as the War Guilt Clause. Let's explore why this clause is so hated and how it caused tremendous economic damage to Germany. First off, let me explain what happened on June 28, 1914, because that date is crucial to understanding why Germany was blamed for the war. On this day, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was assassinated in Sarajevo by a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip. This event set off a chain reaction that would eventually lead to war between the major European powers. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia for the assassination and declared war on them. They then began their invasion of Serbia when suddenly their ally Germany told them to stop. What? Why did Germany tell Austria-Hungary to stop? Well, Germany didn't want Austria-Hungary to end the conflict too quickly. They wanted to take advantage of this conflict and get some land out of it. So they basically told Austria-Hungary to drive their invasion out for as long as possible. But Austria-Hungary took this advice a little too seriously. They ended up invading and occupying not only Serbia, but also Belgium, which was a neutral country. This action immediately put Germany at war with Belgium and eventually France as well. And before you know it, the entire continent was at war. So, who started this mess? Well, again, there were lots of contributing factors. First off, nationalism was at an all-time high in Europe, which led to lots of ethnic tensions. For example, many ethnic groups in Austria-Hungary wanted to break away from the empire and form their own countries. Then there was imperialism, which had created rivalries between the European powers. Lastly, there was militarism, which meant that every country in Europe was rapidly building up their armies, fueling an arms race. All of these factors combined to create a powder keg, which was then lit on fire by a single spark, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. So no, Germany didn't start the war on purpose, but they didn't help matters by supporting Austria-Hungary's invasion of Belgium. Despite this, the French and British rejected Germany's offer and instead blamed Germany entirely for the war. This may seem ridiculous today, considering that almost all historians agree that the war wasn't anyone's fault, but it made sense at the time. You see, the French and British had suffered immense casualties during the war. An estimated 65,000 British and 400,000 French soldiers lost their lives. And they needed someone to blame for all of these deaths. Germany was an easy target since they had just recently been their ally. By blaming Germany, the French and British could avenge their dead soldiers while also avoiding any responsibility themselves. So when it came time to negotiate peace, they used all of their power to punish Germany. The most humiliating of these punishments was the War Guilt Clause. Let me read it to you. The German government shall be held responsible for the whole loss and destruction caused in the French, Belgian, British and Serbian territories during the period of the belligerent occupation of these territories by the German armies and for all damages done in the enemy countries by mines laid down by the German Navy. In simpler terms, this meant that Germany had to pay back every single country that was involved in the war. The amount that they owed would depend on the amount of damage that occurred in each country. Germany felt completely humiliated by this clause, and many Germans to this day still consider it unjust. After all, they were only partially responsible for the war. Yet this clause made it seem like they were 100% at fault. But the War Guilt Clause wasn't the only punishment that Germany faced. They also had to give up a lot of their land, including Alsace-Lorraine, which they'd taken from France in 1871. They also had to give up all of their colonies in Africa and Asia. And they also couldn't have an army larger than 100,000 men. All of these punishments were meant to weaken Germany and prevent them from ever starting another war. But instead they did the exact opposite. They made Germany bitter and filled with hatred towards the rest of Europe. This feeling would play a key role in the rise of Nazism only 20 years later. However, the biggest consequence of the Treaty of Versailles was its financial burden. To make up for all of the damage that they caused, Germany had to pay over 1.3 billion gold marks, or around $33 billion today. The Allied powers expected Germany to pay this money by borrowing it from American banks. However, this plan quickly fell apart when the U.S. economy crashed in 1929. As soon as this happened, the American banks refused to lend any more money to Germany and the French began seizing German assets in occupied zones. By 1932, France had seized so much German property that they even began confiscating church bells to melt them down and use the material to make weapons. By 1920, Germany was desperate for money. They turned to the Allies and asked if they could delay their reparation payments, but the Allies refused. Instead, they told Germany that they had to pay even more money. Germany was outraged, but they had no choice but to comply. Over the next few years, Germany borrowed money from various sources to pay back the Allies. But this came at a cost. They had to pay 10% interest on all of their loans. Eventually, the interest payments became too high and Germany defaulted on their loan in 1932. To make matters worse, the Great Depression hit Germany especially hard. Unemployment rose above 30% and people began panicking. Many Germans turned to the Nazi Party for help. Hitler promised to save Germany from their economic crisis and to relieve them of the burden of the Treaty of Versailles. Since most Germans agreed with him, Hitler was elected Chancellor in 1933. And as soon as he took office, he began violating the Treaty of Versailles. He remilitarized the Rhineland, annexed Austria, and began planning to invade Poland. When the British and French heard about these violations, they were furious. They threatened to go to war unless Germany backed down. But Hitler wasn't afraid. His plan was to make Germany into a military superpower once again. So, he ignored the threats and invaded Poland on September 1, 1939. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. And just like that, World War II had begun. In hindsight, it's obvious that the Treaty of Versailles failed. It failed to bring about lasting peace in Europe. Instead, it created resentment and bitterness between the nations. It also failed to prevent another world war. If anything, it actually caused World War II. However, at the time, the treaty seemed like the best option. The alternative would have been to do nothing, which would have left the underlying issues that caused the war unresolved. Additionally, punishing Germany gave the French and British an excuse to avoid responsibility. In the end, the Treaty of Versailles was a half-baked solution to a complex problem. And unfortunately, the consequences were devastating. Now let's answer the question. Did Germany deserve the Treaty of Versailles? The answer is kind of. The Treaty of Versailles was an extremely harsh treaty that punished Germany severely. However, it wasn't completely one-sided. Germany was able to keep their land and their colonies. Additionally, they weren't completely humiliated. The war guilt clause could have been worded much worse. All things considered, Germany got off pretty lightly compared to the other Central Powers. Austria-Hungary was completely broken up, and their former territories became independent countries. The Ottoman Empire was reduced to modern-day Turkey, and their former territories became independent countries or were taken by other European powers. And Bulgaria had to give up all of their land, and their army was reduced to 20,000 men. Now, check out, why does Germany hate the United States? Or click this other video instead. The Treaty of Versailles was one of the most controversial treaties ever signed. Many Germans felt that it was too harsh and humiliated them. They also thought that it was unfair because they felt that it blamed only Germany for causing the war. On June 28, 1919, representatives of Germany and the Allied powers met together in the Palace of Versailles to finally end World War I. Most people know about Article 231 of the treaty, where Germany was forced to take blame for starting the war. But there were also many other important articles in this treaty that had a huge impact on Germany, such as Article 97 through 120. These articles determine what territories Germany would lose. Let us take a look at all of the German lands that were taken away after World War I. Alsace-Lorraine was one of the most controversial regions that were taken from Germany. This region had been part of Germany since 1871 when Otto von Bismarck united the German states into a nation. In 1866, he went to war against Denmark to acquire Schleswig-Holstein. In 1870–71, he went to war against France to acquire Alsace and Lorraine. Both of these wars were easy victories for the German army. However, Bismarck treated these people differently than the rest of his empire. He placed them under direct imperial rule and did not allow them any self-governance. Bismarck hoped that this would cause the people of Alsace-Lorraine to assimilate into the German culture and forget that they were French. But it had the opposite effect. Living under German rule made the people of Alsace-Lorraine resent Germany and desire to return to France. This resentment was so strong that when Alsace-Lorraine was being discussed at the Paris Peace Conference, delegates from Britain, Italy and the United States argued in favor of giving it back to France. This made the French very happy, and they used this region as an example of how Germany had been taking land from them since 1871. By taking Alsace-Lorraine, France was able to get back all of the territory that they lost during the Franco-Prussian War. Malmedy was another small piece of territory that was taken from Germany. This area is located between Germany and Belgium. During the Middle Ages, this territory had been a part of the Duchy of Limburg. Over time, Limburg was divided up amongst several neighboring states. Eventually, most of it ended up under the control of the Austrian Empire while a small portion was ruled over by the Kingdom of Prussia. When World War I broke out, the neutral Belgians found themselves at war with Germany. Germany invaded Belgium, which caused the Belgians to complain to the British, who then sent their army to defend Belgium. As a thank you, Article 152 of the Treaty of Versailles gave Belgium all of this territory that was previously ruled over by Prussia. The next major piece of territory that was taken away from Germany was Prussia. After the Battle of Tannenberg, the Russians captured a city called Masurian Lake. This battle took place within the province of Prussia. So technically, Masurian Lakes should have been returned to Prussia. Instead, Poland was given this territory. And when the Western Allies created an independent Polish state, they also gave them Upper Silesia. They did this to help buffer the Soviet Union from the rest of Europe. In addition, the Polish gained access to the sea for the first time in 700 years. Most Poles viewed the decision to give the northern portion of Prussia to Poland as a fair decision because ethnic Germans lived there. It was easy for the Germans to accept this loss because this territory was ethnically German. But that could not be said about the next territory that was taken away from Germany. In 1881, a ship called the Jeddah landed in Namibia and became the first German ship to transport goods to Africa. This event is considered to be the beginning of German colonialism. By 1914, Germany had acquired territories in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. Their African territories were known as German East Africa, German Southwest Africa, German Cameroon, and German Togo. Their Asian and Pacific territories were known as German New Guinea, German Mariana Islands, German Caroline Islands, and German Marshall Islands. All of these territories were ruled over by private companies who exploited the land and its people for resources and profit. In fact, German East Africa was one of the richest colonies in the world due to the abundance of gold, diamonds, rubber, and especially cotton. It is estimated that around 70% of the raw materials that Germany consumed came from their colonies. This made Germany extremely dependent on their colonies. But unfortunately, it also led to them losing their colonies. The colonial holdings of Germany were divided up amongst the victorious powers. Britain received German East Africa. Portugal got German Angola. France acquired German Cameroon and German Togo. The Japanese took over German Micronesia. Australia got German New Guinea. And finally, the Dutch received German islands in the Pacific Ocean. Some parts of Germany were not taken away but rather occupied by another country. This included the entire state of Schleswig-Holstein. Throughout history, the people of Schleswig-Holstein had always been loyal to the Danish king. In 1460, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III made a treaty where he allowed the Danish king to keep Schleswig-Holstein if he paid an annual fee. In 1866, Prussia went to war against Denmark to acquire Schleswig-Holstein. Although the Danish fought bravely, they suffered a humiliating defeat at the Battle of Idstedt. As a result, the entire region was annexed by Prussia. However, the treaty stated that the people of Schleswig-Holstein had the right to hold a plebiscite where they could vote on whether or not to remain with Prussia or return to Denmark. In the end, the people voted to return to Denmark. This made Denmark very happy. But it also made the Germans very angry because they felt that the Danish cheated by persuading the people to vote to return to Denmark. Another part of Germany that was occupied after World War I was the Saar. From 1920 to 1935, the Saar region was controlled by the League of Nations. This meant that the Saar was technically not a part of Germany, France, or any other country. The main purpose of putting the Saar under the control of the League of Nations was to guarantee the supply of coal to France. During World War I, the Germans had used the Saar to supply their war machine. As a result, the French were desperate to acquire the Saar after the war ended. At first, the French wanted to annex the Saar and make it a part of France, but they soon realized that this would be too controversial. Instead, they convinced the League of Nations to put the Saar under their control. For 15 years, the citizens of the Saar were prohibited from becoming German citizens. The Saar was put under the control of a governor who was appointed by the League of Nations. The governor's job was to oversee the mining industry and make sure that France got enough coal. Finally, let's discuss the Rhineland. This was the most important region that was affected by the Treaty of Versailles. The entire Rhineland was demilitarized. This meant that no German soldiers or military infrastructure was allowed in this region. The Rhine River had been a strategic location throughout history. As a result, whoever controlled the Rhineland had an advantage over the rest of Germany. This is why the Rhineland was a primary target of the French during the war. By making the Rhineland a demilitarized zone, the French could feel safe from a German invasion. It also prevented the Germans from being able to successfully invade France again. In addition to losing all of these territories, Germany was also restricted in terms of the size of their military. The German army was reduced to only 100,000 men. Conscription was also banned, which meant that nobody could be forced into military service. The German navy was also reduced in size. Germany was only allowed to have 6 battleships. All of their submarines and an air force were forbidden. Many Germans felt that the Treaty of Versailles was unfair because it blamed them for causing the war. They also felt that it was humiliating because it forced them to give up all of these territories. On the other hand, the French were ecstatic with the treaty because they got all of the land that Germany had taken from them since 1871. The British were also happy with the treaty because they were able to get several German colonies, including German New Guinea, German Samoa, and several minor islands in the Pacific. As you can see, the Treaty of Versailles had a dramatic impact on Germany. This treaty is one of the reasons why Germany experienced economic and political instability during the Weimar Republic. In 1919, delegates from the victorious Allied powers met at the Palace of Versailles outside Paris to dictate the terms of peace to a defeated Germany. What followed was one of the most infamous peace treaties in history, an event so humiliating and degrading for the Germans that it directly led to the rise of Nazism and ultimately World War II. So what exactly did the treaty say, and why was it so hated? Well, the treaty consisted of 4 parts. The first part dealt with general issues such as the restoration of Belgium, the return of German colonies to the control of the Allies, and the return of Alsace-Lorraine to France. Part 2 outlined military restrictions placed on Germany. Part 3 dealt with reparations, essentially how much money Germany had to pay for causing all the damage during the war. And finally, Part 4 contained territorial changes and the most controversial section of the entire treaty. For starters, Article 231 placed the blame for the war squarely on Germany, stating that Germany and Austria were solely responsible for all the loss of life, injury, destruction, and economic loss suffered by the belligerent powers as a consequence of the aggression of Germany and her allies. It was this article more than any other that would come to be known as the War Guilt Clause, which is unfortunate because the idea of collective responsibility was actually an idea put forth by the Germans themselves. As early as September 1914, Germany's Chancellor, Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, informed the French ambassador that Germany bore full responsibility for the war, claiming that no one had forced them into it. And this was reiterated 2 years later by Germany's Foreign Secretary, Arthur Zimmermann, who declared, "We are fully conscious that we alone are responsible for the World War." In fact, the concept of collective responsibility was actually quite popular in Germany following the war, with 76% of those surveyed agreeing that Germany was entirely responsible for starting the conflict. So when the treaty forced Germany to accept sole responsibility, it wasn't exactly some sort of radical departure from public opinion. But there was one crucial difference. The Germans hadn't agreed to this beforehand. And furthermore, the idea of collective responsibility was far more vague than the treaty made it out to be. The treaty made it sound as if Germany started the war out of the blue, whereas in reality, there were numerous underlying factors such as militarism and imperialism, which the other powers were just as guilty of. But it wasn't just the War Guilt Clause that offended the Germans. The treaty's territorial demands were also deeply unpopular. For starters, the territory of Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France, something the French had been demanding since the beginning of the war. But Germany was also forced to cede additional territories. Schleswig and Stormarn were given to Denmark, Eupen and Malmedy to Belgium, northern parts of Schleswig-Holstein to Denmark, Memel to Lithuania, Upper Silesia to Poland, and Posen, West Prussia and the city of Danzig to Poland. Additionally, the region of East Prussia was separated from mainland Germany and an independent state of Latvia was formed. The Germans saw these territorial losses as completely unreasonable. After all, Germany had gained over 70,000 square kilometers or 27,000 square miles of land during the war, which seemed to indicate that the general sentiment among the victors was that any further territorial adjustments would be considered excessive. Furthermore, the transfer of territory to Poland, a nation that only regained independence during the war, was particularly galling to the Germans. You see, prior to World War I, the Prussian army had crushed 3 Polish uprisings between 1806, 1830 and 1866, effectively crushing the Polish state and incorporating much of their territory into the German Empire. The Poles had hoped that following the war, their territory would be returned to them, but instead they were awarded even more territory than they had ever possessed before. This was obviously unacceptable to the Germans, who viewed the Poles as nothing more than a bunch of separatists. Of course, the Germans had no one else to blame for the treaty but themselves. Their leaders had literally surrendered, meaning that they had no right to complain about the terms being dictated to them. Still, that didn't stop them from trying. In fact, several members of the German delegation protested the treaty, with one delegate, Johannes Bell, arguing that the peace treaties were an insult to the honor of the German people, adding that no treaty could be concluded on the basis of the president's 14 points. Of course, this was all in vain. Germany was forced to sign the treaty despite its many flaws. And now we get to one of the most contentious aspects of the treaty, reparations. See, in accordance with the principle of making the vanquished bear the cost of the war, Germany was forced to pay billions of dollars worth of reparations to the victorious powers for all the damage they caused. In theory, these reparations were supposed to cover everything from destroyed infrastructure to physical damage, medical care, property loss, and even lost profits. But the problem was that the amount kept going up and up and up. At first, the Allies estimated that the total cost of the war was around 27 billion gold marks, or $6.6 billion US. But after the armistice was signed, that figure ballooned to nearly 132 billion gold marks, or $30.6 billion US. But then President Woodrow Wilson entered the chat and raised it to 330 billion gold marks, or 81.2 billion US dollars. Then in 1921, the French, who were suffering perhaps the most from the war, pushed for a figure as high as 1.35 trillion gold marks, or 332.4 billion US dollars. Now, obviously, this figure was absurd. Germany simply did not have that kind of money, and if they were forced to pay it, their economy would collapse, resulting in hyperinflation like they experienced in the early 1920s. Ultimately, the final figure settled somewhere in the middle at 132 billion gold marks, or 32.6 billion US dollars, which was still too much. But it wasn't just the amount that offended the Germans, it was also the process through which the figure was determined. You see, Germany was ordered to hold individual states responsible for damages done within their borders. Something that was practically impossible since the war had been fought by a unified German empire. Not only that, but each state was left to negotiate individual deals with each of the victorious powers, which inevitably resulted in double or even triple payments for the same damages. And that wasn't even the worst of it. The victorious powers were allowed to take whatever they wanted to cover their costs, which meant that German factories were literally dismantled and shipped abroad to satisfy reparation demands. Overall, the treaty was extremely unpopular in Germany, which shouldn't come as a surprise. By all accounts, it was extremely unfair. Germany was solely responsible for starting the war, even though there were multiple underlying causes. They lost a significant portion of their territory, especially to the resurrected Polish state. And they were forced to pay exorbitant amounts of money to the victorious powers. But the worst part of the treaty was that Germany wasn't even allowed to negotiate the terms. The treaty was literally dictated to them by the victors, who didn't even include any representatives from the Central Powers at the negotiating table. To the average German, the treaty didn't seem like a peace settlement. It looked like a dictatorial punishment, or Diktat in German, which is where we got the name. And this resentment would soon spawn an extremist group that promised to undo the perceived injustices of Versailles. A group known as the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party for short. The Nazis were founded in 1920 by a failed artist named Adolf Hitler, who capitalized on the widespread resentment towards the treaty and promised to restore German greatness. Within no time at all, the Nazis became the largest party in Germany, easily winning the 1932 election. By this point, the Nazis had evolved into a mass movement that enjoyed broad support across German society, which enabled Hitler to become chancellor in January 1933. His first act as chancellor was to dissolve parliament, call for new elections, and outlaw all other political parties, effectively establishing a totalitarian dictatorship. Over the next 6 years, Hitler would undo every territorial adjustment made to Germany during World War I, regaining the regions of Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and France. And it all started with a peace treaty. Click here to watch this video on the Russian Revolution and why it happened. Or click here to watch this video.